Good evening, everybody. We are actually about 10 seconds early today, so nobody can say late.
Yes, which is why you nearly just caught me blathering randomly about people in the chat. Hello! It's been a while. We've been a bit sort of busy with some stuff, and then you were away at a certain conference a few weeks back and decided to bring back a serious con flu.
Yes, I did actually bring back the con flu.
Which is a weird one, to be honest, because it didn't feel like an awful cold for most of it, but it meant that as insufferable as my voice is normally, it was actually even worse. I'll leave you all a moment to imagine that briefly.
Yes, hello everybody. We're back. Can we get some we're backs in the chat?
Yes.
It's been a little while. I should probably slightly explain where we've been.
What do you mean where we've been? We've been here all along.
Yeah, guys, we have been here all along, but really, if we have...
We've been hiding inside your little computers, waiting for you to turn us on again.
Yeah, we've been waiting for you to turn us on again. Waiting for you to turn our stream on again. Ooh, it gets lonely in here.
Yeah.
But no. We just really haven't had much we can contribute with the state of
the slop,
the political temperature, as it were. We were going to do this stream a couple of weeks ago, but we were quite sick. And the other week, quite honestly, we just didn't have the mental energy for it.
No.
And quite frankly, everyone's running around like a headless chicken due to several things recently. But yes, we do try and make sure we slot these in where they will be somewhat watched, but we try not to be too vain with all this stuff.
I think, as I said on the Twitters, that we are back after a brief hiatus to sail a direct course through slop-heavy seas onto firmer evergreen land as we tackle the issue of the Grenfell fire and how its legacy is developed, which I believe is someone requested this directly on Twitter a few weeks ago, but I think we have been asked a few times.
It's something I had notes on from a while back, actually, is the myth of Grenfell. Before we get into this, I will add some disclaimers and say that we are not saying that Grenfell Tower didn't happen, or really that there are many discrepancies in the official version of events. What you will see here is to do with how emphasis works, and especially you will see how framing works. You will notice that disaster management in Britain and most of the Western world is mostly about perception management. There is really nothing that governments, regulating bodies, the courts, the police, anyone can do to really prevent disasters.
No.
These are things that are going to happen with the conditions that are placed on us via modernity, as we'll get to.
And this is without even getting into the sort of question of whether or not disasters are maybe pushed along in certain manners. This is more just fundamentally I think maybe an attempt to address what happens when a regime deeply no longer able to grasp onto certain elements of hard power must deal with certain events so as to deal with the backlash amongst certain populations.
Yes, but if you guys do want to support us, we are still fully monetized on YouTube somehow. I'm not quite sure.
I know exactly why we love. What? Sorry, I've got all my slogans mixed up. Yes. No, I know exactly why we're monetized on YouTube, because we love the nation of Israel.
Yes.
And if you love the nation of Israel too, you should give us your money, because that's what they'd want.
Yeah, that's what they want. Bring them home to our wallets.
Yeah. So you can donate to us either via YouTube through super chats and super stickers, or if you want to be extremely cool and become a channel member, like a small plethora of people are, you can also subscribe to the Substack if you want to give to us regularly, where you will find this stream as a podcast with no ads and the occasional bit of writing, which might be a bit thin on the ground at the moment because we've got a lot of stuff going on. And yes, I think, as you've shared also in the chat, if you want to give directly, you can give through the Ko-Fi link.
Yes, that's the best way to avoid the YouTube tax.
That is enough shelling. I will only remind you that Al Gore's rhythms have not been listened to in a very long time.
No, do interact with the videos in whatever way you see fit.
They are as fresh and vibrant as they have ever been.
Yes.
And he can only hear
will see us through.
That you're hearing those rhythms by interacting with the vidya.
But we'll first get to what is the established narrative of Grenfell Tower? The reason we're doing this is there was the Grenfell report released. Again, the political process takes hold, and it takes 7 years for the reports of these things to come out, by which time a lot of the narratives have been managed so heavily that people forget many elements of the story, and also it allows them to diffuse any anger that was genuinely created by the event. As in, apart from a lot of the fake AstroTurf community action and pressure groups, nobody really viscerally cares about Grenfell Tower.
No. And fundamentally, your top line issues in conversation with this specific problem aren't necessarily the ones that maybe should have been dealt with in the more immediate aftermath, as it were.
Coney current year, thank you for the £5. No, it has been 10 years and they still not have shut the game again.
Is Carlson his shadow again?
Can I has shut, please?
Yeah.
God.
Can you please turn the slop torrents off? I have had enough, thank you.
Thank you very much, yes. But there's the BBC article here which gives us really the completely down the line telling of Grenfell post-report, that this has been softened. The initial narratives were one of Tory council greed, of corruption, of possible
penny pinching,
of possible prison time for people. But really what's happened is they found that, as with many things, this is simply a comedy of errors that the public sector produces by existing.
Yes.
That this is a normal intersection between the public and private sector, which has created a mess. There's a little preamble here which talks about the 72 people killed in 2017 as a result of failures by governments and dishonest companies and lack of strategy by fire services and all of these people who are culpable in this chain of events.
The final report of the 6-year public inquiry has concluded. The damning report sets out a path to disaster at Grenfell, stretching back to the early 1990s, over how fire safety in high-rise buildings has been managed and regulated. The coalition and Conservative governments ignored, delayed, or disregarded concerns about the safety of industry practices, the inquiry said. The report highlighted the systematic dishonesty of manufacturers as a reason for tower block being clad in combustible materials. One manufacturer was also found to have deliberately concealed the fire risks its cladding posed, I should. Yes, also the full report being 1,700 pages, so it's nice and concise.
Well, I won't get into the nitty-gritty of fire rules and fire safety, but a lot of these loopholes, in quotes, that Grenfell Tower exploited were specifically exceptions made for social housing and for the government to penny pinch on its own watch.
But I mean, I don't want to play devil's advocate for a class of elites that I believe are fundamentally like paedophile demons for the most part. But you can't really blame them, can you? If you turn around to these people and go, we want housing, and they've only got £1 billion to provide you with housing, and if you try and provide it in any other manner, or you spend any more than that billion, the government looks like on the face of it is collapsing. So of course you're going to cut corners. Well, I mean, duh.
A lot of this is due to incompetent refitting.
Yes.
Ironically, the building would have been safer if
without the cladding.
Well, yes, and the cladding really is because of demand from central government, and it's because of demand to make these settlements look more presentable, to bring life into them because they can't seem to make the social housing system work at all to deliver anything, and a large part of it, as we'll get into, are eco concerns.
Yes.
This was insulation and cladding. It's supposed to be acoustic. It's supposed to be all these things to all these people. It really is lipstick on a pig, flammable lipstick on a pig. But the fact that they were putting lipstick on a pig is talked about, but the major questions and the major issues that this brought up were very expertly dodged by this. You'll see nothing about illegal subletting, for example, in the inquiry, or you'll see extremely little, and the way it will be framed is in a victimizing manner. But anyway,
surely this has been I would almost say a fundamental problem as long as there has been a managerial mass society.
Yes.
How do you sustain massive population densities in somewhat safe and livable conditions? And it turns out the answer is, especially with certain types of populations, You can't. And trying to essentially square this multi-ethnic circle has led to a crisis like the one we see before us.
Well, they talk about cladding manufacturers, insulation manufacturers, false misleading. Sorry, this is terrible. False misleading claims about its product being suitable for Grenfell. Well, the thing is, manufacturers are incentivized to sell their products. This is a very strange buck passing in that if somebody offers you attended material, I know from my experience in the construction industry firsthand, that you do your due diligence. You don't just believe the manufacturer information on the product. You can't. And in many cases, it has to have specific certifications, which, because this is not a normally insured building, because it's social housing,
yes,
the normal controls via the insurance industry and public liability do not apply.
The liability that would normally be there on the quote-unquote installer, as it were, is null and void because the installer is working at the behest of the government to a budget that they know isn't going to work.
It's also just the budget, so the government just does not double-check manufacturer claims properly, whereas even the most rough-shot private company would do a little bit of due diligence to make sure that they weren't legally responsible.
Well, let's make sure these big sections of Kingspan don't go up like petrol.
Architect Studio E, cladding installer Harley, project manager Ryden, and consultants over fail to identify and act on their responsibilities over fire safety. Again, though, a lot of times you'll find that these are client-end issues, that you will tell the client something and they will not act on it. It's very strange to talk about the refits of this because a lot of the political hot potatoes before this were due to the condition of these housing developments. Ironically, before this, many were campaigning to have cladding, to make their, to have better energy efficiency, in quotes, with the polystyrene installation and the polystyrene cladding, and to have a slightly more aesthetic building. People were crying out for many of the refits that ended up killing people in there. And it's because of these half-hearted social housing refurbishments that are centrally mandated.
Yes, and I think as well, to a certain extent, you've got to think of the position that these fire safety companies are in. They aren't massive. Most of them aren't really able to go out of their own way to essentially provide charity or a public service.
No.
But yet, they turn around to the government and say, oh, by the way, this big public housing building that you want us to refit, we also think it needs X service. And the government turns around and goes, well, we insure ourselves and we don't think it needs X service. The people who are asking for the service but not providing it because it would come out of their own pocket, I don't think you can really find them to be of fault, can you?
Well, really, it's the narrative is broken down into the build-up to the fire, which is characterized by a narrative of neglect, in quotes, and
neglected communities. It's the sign of mass inequality, and inequality is greatest because this is one of the richest boroughs in Britain, and yet it's got some of the most deprived people living in this squalid conditions.
Well, the issue is it talks about the cladding report and a lot of this, but we've been over some of this before, and as we'll get into, a lot of the unsafe building practices in high-rise buildings is, one, due to the fact that high-rise housing should not exist, and without government intervention would not exist. All quote-unquote high-density housing in the UK is ultimately underwritten by the UK government.
Yes.
Apart from very specific, very bespoke, investment-level luxury developments, high-rise housing in Britain is social housing.
But even then, we know from what we've talked about before that 40% of that new housing base has to be mandated as social housing in the first place.
But we'll see that there's a lot of this corner cutting, and especially in the name of eco requirements. And even before that, it was kind of efficiency, energy efficiency stuff, pre-eco stuff we saw that caused the drive for these new insulation projects and these new cladding projects. Talk about governments from 1991 to 2010 and 2010 to 2016, but the real issue is that individual buildings are not on the radar of central government.
No.
And generally not on the radar of local government.
Because they are 4, 5, 6 levels abstracted above thinking about the details of building safety, because they're trying to solve this giant equation of rotating around millions of people involved in social housing that's only got a lifespan of 10 or 15 years.
Yeah.
And how do you shuffle these people from one bucket of it to another bucket, not really caring for whether or not the bucket's got holes in it or is made of something dangerous?
Well, they talk about unscrupulous manufacturers here, and And they talk about how quickly the fire spread and the fact that you have this, this very rapid spread around the cladding. But again, this was a refit. This building's fire loading was changed, and it was changed at the behest of central government targets. It's never something I've seen discussed properly.
No.
The requirements for these refits are what caused this fire. If they hadn't refit the building, or they'd like for like refit it in certain ways, it would be a lot safer, which is the major irony of this. And one of the biggest, I think, chicken and egg, chronology that is brought into this, that people aren't really thinking about the fact of, hang on, why was this building re-insulated and reclad in the first place?
Yes.
And why was it done so cheaply? And, what are the interlocking factors here? It is not simply human greed. There is somebody ultimately responsible for this. I know there's a lot of campaigners on the left who are jumping up and down about prosecutions for this. But the reason that there can't be prosecutions for Grenfell is that they'd have to admit that the entire system of social housing is in itself a death trap.
Yes. And as a consequence of all of this desperate need to shift accountability away from central systems and onto either partisan groups or even maybe private groups, there is in the same turn the ability to manifest and re-manifest time and again the animosity around this problem not being solved, and then use it for their own purposes. You can use it to perpetuate narratives, and even furthermore, change and adapt policy as a response to this national overwhelming crisis. Because of course, people who were criminals that got caught in the Grenfell Tower will have their status as criminals revoked.
But it was one of the things that happened quite quickly. There was this very spontaneous, in quotes, public outcry. And what you get in the aftermath, here, what you get in controlling the narrative around we'll get into the incompetence, the utter incompetence of the fire service and their standing policies, which are still ridiculous. The fire service, really, in how it treats many types of fire, is a joke. And they are mostly governed by liability and safety rather than protection of human life.
Yes.
As most things are in modernity, but still.
But, I mean, I look at this and what I see is a government, fundamentally a central institution that has had to deal with race riots in areas like London, consequence of a narrative of depravity or poverty or inequality, has seen an opportunity where that may happen again and has thrown its hands up and said, well, we'll give you everything.
Yes.
Because we don't want that again now, do we?
What you have is, and as we get on to the story of an underfunded, unloved, troubled building that is filled with illegal subletting.
Just like those people that lived within it.
Yes. Well, it's filled with illegal subletting. It's filled with the exact people who are causing the revenue shortfalls, which has led to this building being in this condition.
So I'm going to have to pinch somebody's thing in the comments here. If I want to avoid being stabbed by the diversity, do we just have to carry around a piece of Kingspan foam? Pretty much, yeah. get like a stab-proof vest made of Kingspan foam.
This is from October 2017, shortly after the Grenfell Tower disaster. Undocumented Grenfell Tower survivors will now have the right to remain permanently in the UK, the Home Office has announced. In a written statement, Immigration Minister Brandon Lewis said illegal migrants caught up in the tragedy would now be entitled to settle in Britain after initially being granted a 12-month amnesty earlier this year. Yeah, as soon as this happened, there was a 12-month amnesty announced. It's so strange that a building full of illegal migrants that is in very poor condition, as well, a lot of this stuff has been scrubbed, really. But I'm not getting into too much of the debate about who was responsible for the condition of the building now. But it's interesting that there's this building full of illegal migrants, full of migrants in general, full of foreigners, basically. A building burns down in Britain, and people notice that it's mostly foreigners, largely illegals.
Who is doing welfare checks on undocumented migrants that purportedly leave and live in social housing that's not registered to them by name? And they are not registered as citizens in this country by name. Who makes sure that these people keep their living conditions safe and cleanly?
Yes. Well, it's the whole point.
Not that I'm suggesting someone should, but maybe we should flip this all back round. If you cannot take care of your own domicile, that should be grounds for instant deportation.
Well, we'll talk about eligible individuals, blah blah blah. But what happened here is we had a Grenfell immigration policy official statistic in 27th of February 2020.
So is this about, the 15,000 of 2,000 residents that lived in that building?
Well, it's about the fact that there are always exceptions made for the client group. In that if a building burns down in Britain and you, because of it, discover that a lot of the occupants of that building were illegal migrants, you can no longer deport somebody when they gain victim.
Well, we could get into the specific about here.
Yes.
On 5th July 2017, the government introduced the Grenfell survivors policy to allow individuals with an insecure immigration status.
It's a great euphemism there.
Who had lost their homes. They're not their homes.
Well,
they're somebody else's homes.
They're somebody else's homes whose identity they may.
Well, you've got even a better one.
Yeah.
To regularize their stay. Would you like to regularize that meal?
Yeah, they must have workshopped that for hours. Hours trying to get around saying illegal migrant amnesty.
A grant of the LOTR provided those directly affected by the fire access to support and assistance, including access to public funds and rights to work in the UK. This scheme was targeted at those who met the qualifying criteria for the policy. It was expected to apply to a limited number of people.
Yes.
On 11th October 2017, the government announced that those who qualified under the survivors policy would be able to apply for permanent residence after 5 years lawful residence. But by definition, the residency is not lawful.
Oh, it gets worse. Relatives policy.
Oh, yes, I've now got to bring my 12 kids over because I may or may have not been, working in the shop
on 11th October
below.
2017, a dedicated Grenfell relatives policy was introduced to allow relatives who entered the UK with LOTR for short periods to top up their stay to 6 months from the date of entry. This will allow more time for them to make funeral arrangements relative to granted leave without recourse of public funds.
But to talk about a government that cuts corners and is cash-strapped, this is a policy that applies to what, at most?
Yeah.
Let's pluck a number, 2,000 people per se. How much do you think it cost to develop and put this policy together and have all the memos put together and have all the people spell check it and read it in Parliament and endorse it as a bill? You're talking millions here, surely, by that point.
Yes.
For this tiny number of people. And of course, at the cost of the taxpayer, because the government
there is no amount of money that the government will not spend to make sure that illegal migrants can stay in the UK. That is one lesson we've learned so far from the narrative of Grenfell.
But the narrative is that there's corner cutting everywhere.
Well, this was the justification for it. This is from July 2017. This is the BBC article that predates this. It says, Grenfell fire, I was too afraid because I'm undocumented.
I'm sorry if this is either Naomi Iqbal or whoever else this is meant to be coming from, but I think that's a you problem.
Yeah, have you tried not illegally being in a country?
Yeah. There have been persistent claims that the Grenfell Tower death toll is higher than official estimates. Oh, you better know it. Because there were undocumented residents living there. One such woman explains why she is too afraid to come forward to the authorities. Rhea is from the Philippines and lived in the high-rise tower with friends. But unlike them, 40-year-old Rhea wasn't a registered tenant, having lost her legal right to remain in the UK in 2012. So she's like, 4 or 5 years on after absconding from a work visa?
Yes.
Having been caught up in the fire on 14th June, she is now homeless and afraid to identify herself to immigration officials. I thought maybe they'd lock me up. I don't think you need to be worried about that one anymore.
But yeah, that's kind of the...
Let's give us a bit more of this. I'm enjoying the slop, as we might refer to it. Rhea arrived in the UK in 2010 on a 1-year working visa with an employer, but this expired. I didn't have money to renew it, and I couldn't find an employer as a solicitor was holding my documents. She was left homeless and forced to rely on friends to let her stay in their homes. She eventually moved into Grenfell at the end of last year. On the night of the fire, Rhea was with a friend in the tower. In the beginning, there was only smoke. Then a fire broke out. It just kept getting bigger and bigger. For me, it's a miracle I survived. Oy vey. She says it was so dark people couldn't see each other. I bet.
Yeah. Oh dear. But here we get into, I guess, a little bit of not the slop, but this is from Amaliha. I believe this is some kind of Muslim vertical by Idman Omar. Grenfell Tower, how the victims' identities affected their fate.
Oh, I'm sure it did. It's a Wednesday, an ordinary summer's night. Not even a beep from a fire alarm. What, you mean chirping?
Yeah.
I thought you people didn't notice that. A blazing fire suddenly breaks out in the fourth floor of a 24-floor tower block in West London, and then within minutes the entire building is alight with flames, burning with blame, coming apart with accusation. It's known through the ongoing inquiry that governmental moral failings resulted in the residents of Grenfell Tower dying that very night. Yes, I stand in solidarity with you too, brother. I think managerialism is its own giant moral failing. Until now, obvious errors, though clearly identified, are yet to be rectified. Cladding still wraps many homes all over London, though the government promised several years ago. Broken policies put in place before the fire have been reviewed, yet remain unchanged. The clear lack of care and justice for the victims reinforces this poisonous societal ideology of the poor, or of the other, being undeserving in a country that welcomes immigrants just to let them down.
And here we go. Here really is the central narrative here. When we get to what is said here, that there is the myth of never again, of the Grenfell survivor.
Yeah.
Of the we were their hosts and we let them down.
Yeah. I mean, they've got a little subtext bit here. Yeah. Mainly marginalised communities occupy the tower, and it seems their identities had a great part to play in their heartbreaking deaths. Historically, council estates have housed immigrants. In the 60s, council homes are categorically said to be for those who could not afford to be aspirational. A clear lack of respect for council residents' potential. Well, yes. I think as a country we should be somewhat dismissive of those people who we have to give free homes to.
Yeah, people who throw themselves on your dime are not worthy of your respect.
No.
That's the way it's been throughout all of human history.
Pity maybe if they are lucky, but respect not at all.
But that's really, we start the arc here, which is
post-Grenfell.
Yeah, the post-Grenfell arc is one of never again. It is one of being they are no longer illegal migrants, they're Grenfell survivors.
Yes.
Then it's like no longer being an illegal migrant, but being a survivor of human trafficking, as their lawyer would advise them to say.
Yes.
It builds up this event as one of, we've not mentioned it yet, as one of the pillars, really, of New Britain.
Yes.
We're back, guys. We finally mentioned New Britain again, and we'll get to how New Britain some of it is later. But this is a very, very New Britain story. But the next part of this story, a bit of a preview there, really, is the fact that we have, I suppose, what has become, through its never again-ness, it is a national tragedy.
Oh, it's a sacred cow.
And you cannot disrespect a national tragedy.
No.
The best... I've just called this section Unspeakable Revisionism, because we'll be talking about really all the things that become socially unacceptable to talk about when it comes to Grenfell. I'm always reminded of... I know it's uncouth to mention China when talking about security state and things like that, but the way that they dealt with Tiananmen Square was not to make it illegal to say, it was to make it rude to say. It was a social faux pas. And discussing some of the, or even making light of some of the events that took place with Grenfell Tower that are in many ways ridiculous. It is ridiculous that this building full of council tenants, many of which are illegal, most of which are foreign, becomes this national tragedy where people must, rend their clothing and gnash their teeth.
It's a uniquely British tragedy.
Yes.
It speaks to our values.
But a little nod to it on the image here. But this is Grenfell Tower model. Paul Bussetti pleads guilty to sharing offensive video of effigy fire, but he refused to narc on the other people involved. Thank you, Paul.
Yes, I mean, I have to admit, I, of course, disavow and would never find anything like this titillating.
Yes.
In but the slightest moment. However, if I was Mr. Paul Bussetti and I was going to do this, I just wouldn't have filmed it.
No. It makes you wonder, where was the free speech union through all of this, though?
Yeah, where's Toby Young to come and
Where's-
protect this guy's freedom of expression?
Oh, well, you see, he was convicted of gross offence. So
And possibly under the...
so it's not lawful free speech. So fuck him.
Unlike those people who were lawful residents.
Yeah. Well, yes.
But his speech was unlawful free speech, so obviously he had to be
So-
charged with a crime.
The illegal migrants go free. Man who makes edgy video go prison.
Yes. But we all know this fucking anyway.
We know this anyway. Yes.
Free speech!
For those of you who don't know, and this is an image from Sky News, so we're not sharing anything vulgar or offensive here that isn't really on the internet. But that mostly brown. that was the Grenfell Tower in the back garden.
I'm not entirely sure that's meant to be a depiction of Grenfell Tower itself. I know it says that on the top, but I'm seeing more of a sort of a Georgian-style building with the white and black lines
it does
up the
look
front.
a bit more Tudor. It
Yeah,
does.
or Tudor, I think, it's more. Yes, I think this is more a Tudor manor house, actually. But as a consequence, of course, of this, we now have... This is by your same Idman Omar again, by the way. I think he was writing for Stylist. But this has now become a sort of woke sacred cow. So I think this article's from about 4 years ago.
Yes.
So even already, 3.5, 4 years after the original event anyway.
Black Fire, Grenfell, and racism's impact on community tragedy. This is laying on very thick. This is them kind of going ham after the fact, because the initial stuff, even though it was ham-handed in the amnesties, was a little bit more subtle than this. But this is really the outgrowth of the narrative, as it were, on Grenfell.
This is quite a long article, but there's just like one paragraph I want to read. I think it's the third one down. Scroll up again, sorry. It would be a comfort to know...
They mentioned George Floyd above this.
This is, of course, in the wake of the summer of BLM.
Of course.
Do you not remember that? Where the BLM rioters got to run around in London and everywhere else in the world and not have lockdown policies put across them, just to further emphasise the fact that these were the regime's little secret pets. But in the wake of that, people obviously thought that this was a time again to push this hot button issue of Grenfell Tower. It would be a comfort to know that something like Grenfell will never happen again. But an estimated... Never again. Oh, sorry, what is it? Never late. Never black-pilled.
Never again. Never again.
Yes. Or also never relax. It will never happen again, but an estimated 500,000 people are still living in buildings wrapped in flammable cladding.
It's more than that. They're still installing it.
With little to no change, a complete disregard for accountability, and the compensation deserved, I have to ask, is this a black thing? But it's just fucking nonsense.
Grenfell was populated with working-class BAME citizens.
I don't think they were fucking working.
And this was neither coincidental nor random. No, it's not, because these are the people who live at the behest of the...
Sorry, that's misinformation. They were not working, because most of them did not have visas to work, as was proved with our Filipino example earlier on.
It's really interesting how the narrative here is flipped, though. You have this flipping of the narrative where the fact that British social housing is full of non-British people is turned into this idea that we have failed these people.
Oh, yes. This is not a failure of the fact that complex mass societies just can't be sustained under their own weight. It's that white people have emotionally and morally failed their black clients.
Yes, they have emotionally and morally failed, effectively, their pets. Because
I'm sure absolutely no one that was involved with the local council decisions in this region, I'm sure every single one of those people was white as well.
We're reaching peak New Britain here,
bonkers, barmy, stormzy New Britain, guys. Yo, Theresa May, where that money for the
money for them Grenfell programs? It's New Britain.
I done lost all my trainers in the fire.
I done lost my trainers in the Grenfell fire.
Yeah, it wasn't even in the building, but he's lost £15,000 worth of tracksuits.
It is really just emblematic, though, of the idea that the three things that we give the foreign people as our system crumbles beneath their weight must be good enough.
I also, to a certain extent, I like the attempt at almost like anonymous style obvious like symbology in the image at the top of the article here, that all these faceless anonymous leaders that befell and let the black community be failed, as if these people don't have faces, names and addresses that are very obvious, that we all know.
Yes.
That these people aren't just public elites.
Thank you, Israel Daramola.
Very based.
But there are certain things within the Grenfell narrative that you are not allowed to discuss. I'll give you a brief roundup here before we go over each of them. First of all, it is the impetus behind the cladding. A lot of cladding on buildings now, a lot of the unsafe cladding was introduced for eco reasons. It is green cladding, it is noise pollution cladding, it is meant to solve all our ills by the hand of regulation, but it turns out that more regulation is the key. Well, one of the big things, I forgot to read this bit out, is that the central myth in terms of planning for Grenfell Tower is that you can legislate away all danger. Fire safety is active. It is something that is done by the people who are responsible for it in a building. No amount of policy can make a building safe. It's about conscientious people in the correct place, and especially it is about the cooperation of tenants within the building. Yes. Something you do not get as a matter of course, especially in London social housing.
I mean, fundamentally, there's the other aspect as well, that, you know, I'm not trying to be biased or pick favourites, but this doesn't happen in large tower blocks in areas like Glasgow often. No. There's the occasional fire, and sometimes they're not pretty. But these buildings going up like giant stacks of dried out rubbish, that doesn't happen. And that might be as a consequence of the fact that fundamentally a bunch of sub-Saharans, people from the Indo-Pak region in East Asia, who maybe have never lived in a building that's more than 2 stories, being shoved into like a chicken coop that's 24 stories tall, has very little ventilation, and you're talking about people who maybe traditionally cook in different manners. I don't think that's going to work, is it? It's just a kind of disaster waiting to happen, really.
Well, what we have is, the green central push for cladding, the illegal immigration and ethnicity of the tenants is inverted. It was talked about as a tragedy, but no one ever asked the question...
Is it a cause?
Why is London's social housing so full of foreigners and illegal foreigners? How is this allowed to happen? And how did this contribute to, one, the condition of the building, and how did the condition of the building contribute to the fire itself? These questions have never been answered.
Well, yeah, and I know you're going to go into a bit about the firefighting policies and the fact that these aren't entirely appropriate, but to the sort of point you've got before that, I think there's an interesting question to ask of, can it be put upon firefighters to appropriately assess and deal with that situation when subletting and essentially a 2 or 3 person occupancy flat becoming an 8 or 9 person occupancy flat? Is that something that they are kitted out with to contend with? They think they're moving 900 people out of this building, and all of a sudden it turns out it's 3,000 or 4,000 people they're moving out of this building.
Yes.
Was that, when it was originally built in the 70s, built for that sort of ingress and egress? I doubt it.
Well, a large part of what isn't discussed as well is also the fact that the illegals in the building aren't just staying with friends.
They're subletting.
They are illegally subletting, many of which are doing so via identity fraud.
Yes.
You end up with these, tenants of tenants, and they end up being able to pay for certain stuff using your identity. These are the people who are stealing your identity. It is the people living in the social housing off your dime, paying effectively another foreigner to rent the property to them, and then what they're doing is they're using your details to order Uber Eats.
I was actually wondering, thinking about this now, I wonder if there was anyone who, let's say, for example, Brian from Barnsley all of a sudden gets a phone call 3 days later as a welfare check to make sure that he's still alive because a large number of his identification documents are found in a burned out flat in the Grenfell building.
Well, it's an open secret that tenancy fraud, aka illegal subletting, is endemic in London. If you go into any housing development anywhere with social tenants, you will find illegal subletting. It is too profitable.
Yes.
And it is too badly enforced, and it was widespread within Grenfell Tower. But it's not something that is ever discussed, that these people are not only here illegally, they are staying somewhere illegally. They are adding to this huge problem in London that is costing, millions of pounds, and that is the reason that these buildings can't be refit properly, because their tenants are a bunch of shiftless illegal immigrants who don't pay for anything and drain the tax system.
And they're also expropriating their own fellow immigrants who can't access cheap housing, because instead, by the nature of the fact that they have no documentation and have come here illegally, the only housing they can access is expropriated, high-priced sublets that are low quality.
Yes, the profit there, the money goes to organised crime from abroad. It does not go to local authorities, and that's why there's no money for the Gibbs. Yes. You ate it all. I'm afraid. You soaked up all the Gibbs. There is no more Gibbs.
And I mean, this is something we'll probably talk about a bit more at the end, but something that just has sprung to my mind as well is the examples we're looking at here of these sort of issues that should be revised when it comes to Grenfell. These are not issues that only exist in the inner city of London, are they? These are issues that exist across Britain. The fact that this sort of Grenfell-style event hasn't basically become a weekly phenomena on British TV screens is in and of itself a bit of a miracle, because there's almost sort of an attempt to hyper-focus on Grenfell in this locality to sort of obscure and lie by omission about the fact that this is a nationwide problem.
Yes. Another thing that's not... It's talked about somewhat, but really the incompetency... I'd say the incompetency of firefighting is actually due to the endemic issues of high-rise buildings. Because there's a great little bit here about fire drills. There it is. God, the fucking autoplay. Oh, play our video, please, and fuck off.
This is about the issue of evacuation. I was going to maybe go to the paragraph above. If everyone were to evacuate...
No, I want to start here. Sorry.
All right, cool.
He talks about fire compartmenting and why they tell people to stay put in a fire like this. A lot of it's liability-wise, too. And a lot of the way that they think about fire, especially in a building like this, is extremely it's not outmoded. It's very fanciful, I would say. But the building is designed to contain fire in each individual flat, and for the stairways explicitly to remain clear of smoke and heat. This is why it is vital all doors and fire doors are closed in event of a fire. I've encountered this myself professionally, in that nobody wants to think about what happens when you get a fire that spreads. Because as soon as a fire spreads properly, even with the suppression system, and there was so much talk about suppression systems, and good lord, we'll get onto that later. But a lot of the thinking about fire in the fire service, if you look at their contingencies, is fanciful. They don't plan for events where there could be a total loss of a building because there's not supposed to be. In an event like this, yes, what the fire service said and did got probably most of the people who died killed. But there is no method, as he goes on to say here, for evacuating a high-rise building in a fire, because you can't.
Yes.
The building is designed to... Yeah, sorry. If everyone were to evacuate around the same time, opening doors as they did so, that would immediately compromise the fire safety of the building, blah, 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 aside from all the crush injuries, despite the guy who let the thing set on fire, leaving his flat on fire, basically, and leaving his windows and door. Anyway, this is a very stupid argument, in my opinion. Oh, everyone leaving a flat that's not on fire compromises the fire compartmenting. Does it now?
Unless, for some reason, they were walking through all these doors that were already open that, for some reason, could not close on their own behest.
Yeah, because they've been propped open because the corridors are full of rubbish. If our residents opened all their doors and the stairwell at the same time, blah, he's talking about, quite simply, moving away from a stay-put policy would kill people, create a chimney effect, spreading fire. Again, all the fire doors were propped open. All the closers didn't work because, again, it's a social housing building ruined by social tenants.
I mean, this is a great bit coming up next here.
This is why you're not allowed integrated alarms or communal fire alarms in nearly all residential high-rise buildings. You aren't supposed to hear alarms because you aren't supposed to evacuate. Only the flat affected is supposed to evacuate. This is also why there were no fire drills at Grenfell. There shouldn't be. And I've not got it up here. There's a Guardian article that basically just says the way to stop Grenfell from happening is to just completely remove the idea in our minds of high-rise residential housing. I would not spend more time than I was legally required to in a high-rise residential building. They are death traps, all of them. There is no such thing as a safe, from a fire perspective, high-rise residential building.
And also, it's like Judge Dredd, but even less cool.
Well, it's just that, yeah, logically, modeling-wise, apart from like a black swan event like this, they shouldn't evacuate. But when a building is literally burning down, people should leave. And it's the rigidity of this policy and this idiot-proofing. They treat the fire service and people in positions of fire responsibility as people completely bound by policy, these automatons who are not able to think on the fly. And really, once it became clear that the fire was no longer compartmented and was spreading externally, they should have given an order to evacuate the building. They didn't, because of the rigid thinking surrounding this, and because of how, I guess, legalized and insurance-ized a lot of this is, in that there is a set procedure. You treat people like cattle as kind of you're supposed to, but there is no real thinking that this could happen.
I do like the next paragraph as well, though, just briefly. After Grenfell, there were multiple comments from residents and politicians about the lack of smoke alarms. They are obviously unaware that these buildings are not allowed such alarms, and if they were found to be present by a fire safety inspector, they would likely be ordered to remove them.
Yes, because if you hear a smoke alarm or for an extended period in your neighbours, it will start to panic. Basically, they don't want you to know when your building is on fire because your building is a death trap.
Because you become a greater threat to yourself by trying to evacuate for a brief moment than you would otherwise be to yourself staying put. Which is a very bizarre bit of sort of managerial mass calculus to engage in.
No one without government impetus would build high-rise housing. No. It is, in my view, insane to have high-rise housing. It is insane.
Do you know anyone that went out of their way to actively live in a high-rise building?
I know one person who tried to, but it's yuppies in London, but it's the luxury development, even though those are worse in certain ways, I will say. But the next one, and the next couple talk about, are fake survivors and destruction of housing by migrants, especially via fire. Kind of self-explanatory here, but there was a very incompetent pair of Jamaicans who went, "Yeah, man, I was in the Grenfell," and there's like pictures of them at a party at the same time, basically. Yeah. Oh, I can't remember how they got. It was really stupid and bungling. I don't know how safe it is to. There is no way of proving that many of the people who claimed they lived at Grenfell, that there is no documentation
because they're undocumented themselves.
Yes. So they're very, and because
this is a bit, you can't dig the burial site up because it's holy, therefore you can't prove people aren't in there, and therefore can't prove that it's not a burial site.
I would say if someone were to go out of their way to accuse a Grenfell survivor who'd received compensation of being a faker without definitive proof,
you would go through a massive fucking slander and libel case.
Yes, you would go through a libel case, which is not what I'm saying. But it is very difficult to establish the facts either way, in any case where there is not actual documentation. This is why you don't live as an undocumented migrant in a high-rise building. You can just not do that.
Well, if only these people had the foresight to consider this.
There's some great stuff here as well from Refugee Action. Fires don't happen in a vacuum. What's going on in the barracks housing? This is about the fact that they tried housing a bunch of asylum seekers in old defense infrastructure, like Napier barracks.
Yes.
And the migrants went, "I don't like my free stuff," and set fire as migrants tend to do, set fire to their accommodation. There are dozens of cases of this. I'm highlighting 2 here. I don't want to make this into a migrant set fire to their accommodation all the time stream.
But if you know of the phrase tandoori oven, You know enough.
Well, I'll go into that a little bit when I talk about buildings in general, but they talk about fires don't happen in a vacuum. They talk about the fact that the poor migrants set their housing on fire because they were feeling worried about COVID-19, basically.
Aww.
That's the excuse here. But here's another one. Again, another one. Asylum seeker 36 who claimed he was suffering from acute stress when he set fire to his bed at Migrant Hotel and then went on the run for 11 months, is jailed for 3 years. I'm seeing a pattern here, but the fact that there's a lot of deliberate and non-deliberate fire setting by migrant populations is not something you can talk about. The ignition source and the first minutes and hours of the fire is not really something you're supposed to talk about. There's speculation as what caused it. It could have been faulty electronics. We're not quite sure. But having a building stuffed with illegal migrants, and even legal migrants in quotes, in a poor condition, there's detritus everywhere, there's doors propped open, there's people using possibly dodgy electronics. It is a recipe for disaster. And what you learn if you do anything to do with fire safety is that your main concern is ignition points.
Yes.
It is how do fires start? Because once a fire has spread from the size of about a waste paper basket, you would struggle to control that fire with a fire extinguisher. People don't understand quite how self-propelling fires are when they take hold in even just like a small office. And that's why really, when a fire happens, you leave. But you can't leave because your high-rise building is a giant... It's like a giant Rube Goldberg machine meant to make you die in a crush. And so the one thing you're supposed to do when a fire starts, you can't. But I digress. But the narratives around the causes of the fire, the risks of fire in buildings like that, and the inherent really mistreatment of buildings by non-British communities and especially by illegal, migrants, is something not talked about. And you will get extreme social pushback if you try and talk about those things in polite circles. What are we moving on to here then? Sorry, I'll get the notes back out because we're getting towards kind of the bigger picture stuff here. I'll try and rattle through these. What Grenfell obscures as a single example is the dire state of British housing stock in general, especially considering how bad things are on the private rental market. There's a very duplicitous article here from the BBC talking about, it's called A Tale of Two Towers, How Fire Safety Differs at Luxury London High-Rise and Margate Estate. I'm not going to read this because this is a massive sleight of hand. Yes, poor people live in worse buildings than rich people.
It's not even this.
Yeah.
This is a basic failing of recognising the fact that a building that is looked after for private interests is in a better condition than a building that's looked after for public social interests.
That's what I was getting into. Have you noticed that people who care about their surroundings tend to die less in fires?
Wow, I hadn't thought about that. I mean, I can see the correlation, but could you explain the causation to me?
In Victor House, where is it? It's in Margate. Look, what do you notice with all these people from the housing tower they're using as a Grenfell analogue? What do you see about these people? What do you notice about the people that they're sharing here? They're not very Grenfell-esque. I thought it was a black fire.
Yeah, I thought is this a black problem? Evidently not.
It does seem to be a little bit of a sleight of hand, so I just thought that was just one of the dirtiest things that I've seen.
Yes, I know you're also going to slot in some of our previous streams here. There's one that's not directly linked here, but I just want to mention it because I still think it's like one of the fundamental issues that like the British government will have to deal with for the next however many decades.
What's that?
And we covered it on the Everyday Lies stream.
Yes.
Where we were discussing a previously built student accommodation building that was knocked up in the 70s that was, at one point, refitted.
Yes.
With the same cladding. Now, the article that we read and the way that it was put forward on the headlines and in the brief blurb made it seem as if migrants had been put into this building at the behest of all these students who would otherwise have lived here at £600-700 a month at these luxury condos for students and blah blah blah. However, a few more lines down in the article, you realise that this building in question has been lying dormant essentially since COVID, because as a consequence of the Grenfell inquiry, they deemed it not suitable for students anymore.
Yes.
So what they're suggesting is that the British government is going out of its way to put these asylum seekers, these migrants, these people they care so much about and are willing to do so much for, into what they have admitted are tinder boxes, knowing fair well through the advice of their own NGOs that these people are likely to start fires. How does this not go horrendously wrong at some point?
Now, that's the point, yes, in that all this pressure creates this situation where you have these multiple warring narratives. And as we'll get into, a lot of this is to just hide the threadbare nature of reality. That you really can't have an honest discussion about the state of Britain's housing stock.
No.
And the wider picture is a picture of that. One of the, I guess, it's only got about 3,500 views here, 3.2k views. But one of the streams that we did that was better received back a long time ago, this is more than 2 years ago now, was called The Infinite Council Estate. And here we talk about how the planning rules and planning funding, and especially kind of new housing funding in Britain, is leading to a state where all housing developments, especially high-rise housing, all of it has to be a certain percentage social housing. And as such, coupled with that, the use of DSS, aka housing benefit, and you have a picture where any domicile in Britain can overnight become effectively a council house. That's what that stream's about. But this interlocks with the degradation of housing quality. We talked about the absolute state of new builds and the fact that a lot of the we'll get into that in a second. A lot of the cladding techniques that are used for eco reasons are just as flammable, if not more flammable, than those on Grenfell. And there's the push and pull between green policy and fire policy and public policy here.
I like that we've got a climate change note on this one now as well.
But to go back to the Infinite Council Estate, the real problem is that somebody that does not own a house, is not paying for a house, will not look after it.
There's no incentive.
There's no incentive there. So you end up with this mass degradation of British housing stock. Again, to go into more of the new build stuff.
The attempts to sort of rapidly plug these sort of holes where there should be a supposed quantity of housing have actually been done on the cheap. And have been further sort of, I don't know, driven into essentially unsustainable insanity on the basis of the fact that we must throw people into eco-friendly housing as soon as possible.
Well, it is something that does not live in the confines of reality, and yet we have these expanding versions of it. There's something called Aabs Law.
You might want to go back to the OBS thing and make sure you put the article up.
I'm about to, yes.
Cool.
There's something called Aabs Law, which is the result of
poor baby Awab Ishak.
Yes,
it is a great misfortune that his parents fundamentally did not care about living in a mouldy house.
No, but really what it is thank you, Forge in the Ashes. We forgot the weather report. I'll quickly talk about the weather. It was sunny, but then the monocloud came back. Yeah, and that's it. We all live in the monocloud. But thank you for the donation there, Forged in the Ashes. And thank you for the contribution to the Theakston Fund. Again, if you want to contribute to us, we are still monetized, and you can do so most easily or with the least cut taken by the Ko-Fi.
And we are ever so desperately in need of much Theakston's Dark Mild.
Yes, we need Theakston's money.
But as a consequence of this, essentially, council housing was framed by government agents and leftist reporters as a racial issue.
Yes, so once again, it is really, you can see how the narrative from Grenfell was picked up.
Well, no, I was going to say that was set down really heavily in Grenfell, and they tried to make it seem as if it was demeaning to think that social housing was a racial issue, but now they've come round all the way to the other end, which is that, well, of course social housing is a racial issue, to the extent that it's I can't even begin to describe how rapidly that sort of turned round, but I see that as almost deeply kind of like...
It's very subversive because the idea that social housing is taken up by migrants was told to us to be a lie.
Yes.
For the majority of the Labour government and for the majority of the Cameron government, we were told that migrants were not unfairly taking up social housing.
And then we're told that it's not fair that migrants do make up the majority of people in social housing. And now we're being told that social housing is an issue that should primarily relate to foreign people.
Yes.
So
but also,
it's come completely full circle.
But we need to be concerned with the quality of foreign housing because we're not being good guests to our foreign guests.
No.
And that really is the crux of the narrative around Grenfell and around this Aabs Law.
We are not a grateful host nation to our guests, are we?
There's something, again, here from The Guardian, and they're seeking this out. UK asylum seekers, are you affected by damp and mould in your accommodation? We want to speak to asylum. There's so much like visceral desire for this narrative that there's these public calls for this victimhood to be put on display.
These people that have no tenancy agreement that's official, they have no ability to really pay for gas or electricity and heat and ventilate their home because they are undocumented by their own nature. Therefore, they are sitting in houses that they are actively making damp by their own mistakes and are turning around to us going, that dampness is your fault.
Yes.
Maybe, I don't know, heat your house, Mohammed.
Or what you could do is, if it gets a bit mouldy in the corner, once a week, clean the corner, Mohammed.
Or fuck off back to where you came from.
Or you can go back to your non-damp dwelling in Karachi somewhere. It's your choice. You are choosing to live in a damp house.
Well, no, someone's correctly pointed out in chat here, expecting our dusky brothers and sisters to know how to run a dehumidifier and not having damp, mouldy homes is in contravention of their human rights. My word. How correct you are, good sir.
But you see this rabid desire for these narratives to justify what is going on in the housing sector and with immigration. Let's talk about the stuff we talked about earlier. Expanded polystyrene is just as deadly as ACP cladding in a fire.
Also, this is the stuff they had planned to refit to all the places they had refit with Grenfell cladding.
Yes.
Which the New Zealand government found out to be just as bad, if not worse, before even the Grenfell fire happened, I believe.
But yes, the polystyrene cladding that is put on for eco reasons is just as deadly, if not more deadly, than what was used in Grenfell Tower. Again, there is this push and pull between these Soviet-style targets, or there's a Soviet-style target to have this amazing coddling housing for our dusky brothers. But there's also this central Soviet target to have this amazing eco-housing that's full of polystyrene and is hermetically sealed. But it turns out that creates damp. It turns out a lot of the refitting efforts, actually, to make social housing that migrants were put in more energy efficient is what created the damp problem, in the same way that the cladding that was put on Grenfell Tower to make it more insulated and make it more soundproof is what caused the fire to spread so quickly. We have an old housing stock that is designed for a certain style of heating and a certain style of living. And when you're trying to squish that into an eco box, you create these self-inflicted problems, which we must then throw infinite money at migrants to solve.
They're saying exactly what we've said here.
Yeah.
Changes to Irish building regulations introduced in December 2011 mean that all new homes are designed to use 60% less energy than homes built up to 2005 standards, which on average translates to mid A3 building energy rating. So far, so good. But research carried out by this magazine has revealed that 63% of these homes are reliant on so-called natural or background ventilation. This means nothing more than drilling a hole in the wall and slapping a grill over it. Despite the fact that there is little evidence that this is an adequate solution, it's entirely permitted by regulations, because it's the most cost-effective recourse out there. If your sole concern is meeting the requirements and the government's guiding on ventilation, it's the default choice of most developers, just like all these other green measures.
Yeah, they talk about Category 0 cladding. And Category 0 cladding is basic cladding that's not certified. But the government allowed it to continue, again, because they thought it would hurt net zero.
Yes.
It's all of this stuff just does come home to roost. Shall we get to some of our conclusions then?
Yeah. We'll quickly finish up, I think.
I don't actually have our conclusion. but I will do. And there they are. Aha! I found our conclusions. I found them, Evelyn. The real narrative of Grenfell Tower is that all migrants deserve unlimited, high-quality free housing, which they will immediately destroy.
But them destroying it is, of course, our fault.
Yes. It adds to the narrative. It is underpinned, really, by the narrative of housing as a human right. But it is such a powerful kind of social event. Very few people would register a dissenting opinion on something like Grenfell Tower, and yet not to do so concedes to all of these precepts of not only unlimited immigration, but unlimited social welfare. And you can also see how race is used as an obfuscation tool in order to deflect from discussions of practical reality. And the reason we're directing you, and I'll put them in the video description if they're not in there already, to our previous construction streams, is that really the tragedy of Grenfell is a massive, massive distraction from the rotting nature of Britain in general. That Grenfell Tower really is a product of decline, and it is not only a product of decline, it is a through line. It is a product of the socialist policies of the 60s and 70s, which led to the ideas of high-rise housing, cities in the sky that became slums in the sky in general, the failed policy to refit these, the policies of social housing in general.
And trying to squeeze about 1 million foreign folk a year into them as well.
To sound like a libertarian, these people were killed ostensibly by state planning. State planning created the high-rise buildings that are death traps that no one would live in without state planning. State planning created the flawed refits and the eco requirements that created an even bigger death trap than these buildings were already. And central planning brought in the migrants that would degrade this building, degrade the income base of the council, and degrade the housing authority's ability to refit the building without massive bailouts from central government. All of this is a through line of management, of managerialism. And really, if you don't want Grenfell Towers to happen, you don't have mass migration, you don't have high-rise housing, and you don't have social housing.
No.
Without those three things, Grenfell Tower could not have happened. But we are told to end these things.
And systems must be further developed. We must more intensely involve ourselves in the process of providing social housing to those poor asylum seekers and refugees that have come away from their undeveloped and backwards liberal lands.
The people who were in the building should not have been there, and the building itself
shouldn't have been there either.
Under proper conditions would never have existed. That is the central thing that you are never allowed to talk about when it comes to disasters like this.
In conclusions,
yes,
Grenfell did happen, but it shouldn't have.
Yes, that's a good way of putting it. I'm sorry it's been so long between these streams, guys. We'll try and get more out. We've got a few things planned, but quite honestly, we've just been a bit stuck with stuff. We've been a bit busy with real life stuff.
And there's also
tired as well.
There's also the fundamental issue we've mentioned a few times, which is that we don't want to do streams for the sake of it. We do not want to just broadcast for the sake of broadcasting. We'd like to think that at least in our overview of the last hour or so that we've done over the Grenfell stuff here, you're going to get some evergreen content about an issue that people are going to talk about, last week for a day or two and then forget.
Well, the Grenfell is such a good example because it's something that you would never think of in these terms unless you were, let's say, instructed, unless you were inculcated, unless you were somebody who was able to view it from a different angle. Being able to step outside of the narrative and look at its utility is, I think it's one of the better things that we can do. But really, Grenfell Tower is part of an interlocking symphony of social narratives that invert many of the obvious points of reality, of the brownification of Britain in general and social housing especially, of the unviability of centrally planned housing and social housing, and of the inability for regulation to keep people safe in reality. Regulation doesn't do anything in the abstract. It is about having conscientious people in the correct positions, and most of all, it is about creating an environment where people can be truthful with each other.
Excuse me, I reject your reality and regulate my own.
Well, as you put, it's also a testament to the fact that multicultural societies cannot exist.
Multi-ethnic societies, because let's be honest, multiculturalism is the negation of culture.
Yes. Multi-ethnic societies don't work because they can't be honest with themselves. They can't be honest with each other. something that creates quote unquote, ethnic and racial equality doesn't interact properly with reality. It becomes a lie. And because it becomes a lie, everything is based on that lie. And because everything is based on that lie, we cannot face up to the fact that the housing that we have provided by the government, in quotes, is not fit for purpose and never has been.
No.
And that's not a discussion that anyone is willing to have, that the social housing project has failed. The high-rise housing has failed. And that centrally planned targets for fire protection and fire safety have failed because they were never adhered to, because you have a building that nobody wants full of people that shouldn't be there who don't look after it.
Yes. I think we've got a couple of chats at the end just to catch up on before we go.
I don't think so.
Have we been through them all?
Yes, I even went through that. I will double check.
Oh, I don't think we had Coney Current Year's second one.
Oh, sorry.
Consequences of ignoring the ceiling bird chirp, which is, of course, a joke I've tried to refrain from making during the course of this stream.
Chirp. There's been enough chirps in chat, to be fair. Thank you for your chirps in chat. I will just say, before we leave, once again, do dance to algorithms. It's good to see you guys again. It's good to be back. We'll try and have some more stuff out in the anti-politics Substack and stuff like that. But to be honest, we'll do stuff when we think it's relevant. We don't just want to feed you our own version of slop.
No, and also, in a certain extent, I would say people should maybe be more forward with asking about certain subjects. I can't promise that I won't be dismissive and assume that your question that you've asked or your topic that you want to cover is stupid, but if you come to us and it's a good one,
Well, I'm working on them currently because I've had a couple in the last few weeks, but there is a process by the Ko-Fi where you can commission videos. Don't worry, the money will be sent back if I don't accept them. I've not accepted a few of them, but there's a couple I have accepted that'll be coming up relatively soon. Thank you for your patience on those, guys. I know it's been a couple of months since I was sent those, but Ko-Fi likes to hide notifications from me. So, but to be fair, I've had some good jumping off points. So do, if you want to, commission videos. I think it's one of the few things that is like a good kind of positive kind of relationship there. I don't generally like being told what to research, but
I think sometimes it's nice to just give us a little jog towards a certain direction, especially if it's something. I mean, obviously at the time that person requested it, the report was coming out about it, but really I had not thought all that much about Grenfell in quite an extended period of time. So to have someone sort of suggest, why not give this an extra look so that we come back to it, is something I'm more than happy to do. And I think if other people have suggestions about things that are evergreen and relevant, especially to the subjects that we talk about more often, feel free to let us know. I don't always bite.
Okay, anyway, all that's left to say is have a good evening and goodbye.
Go to the pub.